History is filled with contradictions, but few are as striking or as uncomfortable as the story of Henry Clay Frick. In his lifetime, he was one of the most disliked men in America. A titan of industry whose wealth rose on the backs of exhausted workers, a steel executive synonymous with broken unions and violent labor wars, a man who survived assassination only because he boxed his attacker into submission. Newspapers wrote of him with bitterness. Laborers cursed his name. Even among the elite, admiration came with caution, as if Frick's fortune carried the smell of smoke from the furnaces that produced it. And yet, more than a century after his death, thousands of ordinary visitors quietly line up on the sidewalks of Fifth Avenue, waiting patiently not to condemn him, but to step inside the mansion he built. They whisper beneath coffered ceilings, pause beside fountains, and gaze at Rembrandts hung exactly where Frick wanted them. They describe the building as serene, peaceful, beautiful. It is one of the great ironies of American memory. The same man who once represented everything ordinary citizens despised about industrial power is now the anonymous architect behind one of New York's most beloved institutions. The violence that defined his reputation has faded. The buildings he left behind have not. And it is through those buildings, more than any steel mill, any strike, any boardroom battle, that Frick ultimately shaped the way he is remembered. This is the story of that paradox. How a man feared in life became admired in stone. To understand it, you must first understand the world his homes were built into. The Gilded Age was an era obsessed with display. Wealth had to be seen to be believed. And so families like the Vanderbilts, Astors, Whitneys, and Huntingtons erected palaces along Fifth Avenue and Newport's cliffs. Structures so massive, so theatrical, that they were treated as architectural declarations of victory. But as the decades passed, almost all of these palaces vanished. Some were demolished when their fortunes collapsed. Others fell victim to rising taxes, changing tastes, or simple neglect. Fifth Avenue devoured its own past and replaced marble with glass, ballrooms with boutiques, porticos with corporate lobbies. Frick's residences, however, survived. Not because they were loved, not because they were protected by sentiment, but because they were designed with a purpose deeper than luxury. While other mansions served as seasonal stages for society's rituals, cotillions, proposal dinners, debutante balls, Frick built with an entirely different intention. He did not construct homes. He built arguments. Arguments about power, about permanence, about what a man could force into existence if he refused to bend to public opinion. And, perhaps most importantly, arguments about legacy, how one could sculpt memory long after the world had stopped listening. To trace that transformation, we travel through 3 homes, each a different expression of Frick's ambition and unease. The first is Clayton, his Pittsburgh mansion. Built at the height of industrial warfare, it was a residence that combined domestic order with the architectural vocabulary of a fortress. Its stone exterior, tightened windows, and heavy forms reflected a man who understood that success had also made him a target. The second is Eagle Rock, his Newport estate. It was Frick's attempt to infiltrate the world of old-money families who considered men like him necessary but unrefined. Unlike the fortification of Clayton, Eagle Rock offered a softer facade, shingle-style comfort designed to prove he understood elegance, even as he remained socially distant from those he wished to impress. The third, and the most consequential, is 1 East 70th Street in Manhattan, the mansion Frick conceived not as a home but as a monument. Here, Frick abandoned the theatrics of Gilded Age display and embraced classical restraint. Limestone walls, mathematically perfect proportions, rooms designed both for living and for displaying the art collection he believed would outlive him. This mansion was not merely constructed to house his family. It was crafted to reshape his reputation, to convert public outrage into cultural respect, to allow a future America to forget the strikebreaker's name and remember instead the connoisseur, the patron, the builder. But the contradiction remains. How does a man whose wealth was born of such brutality now stand behind one of the calmest, most elegant spaces in American culture? How did a businessman detested by workers, distrusted by rivals, and feared by politicians leave behind homes that people now treat with reverence? The answer lies not in Frick himself, but in what he understood better than his peers, that architecture is not just shelter, it is narrative. It is memory made material. It is the only form of storytelling that cannot be interrupted once the walls are set and the doors are closed. Frick's contemporaries built for fashion, for spectacle, for the fleeting glamour of an age that believed wealth could last forever. Their homes were extravagant, yes, but rooted in the tastes of a moment. Frick built for centuries. His mansions were designed to withstand criticism, economic collapse, and changing architectural trends. He built with the clear-eyed knowledge that hatred burns fast, but stone decays slowly. And so today, when modern visitors enter the Frick collection, they step into more than a museum. They walk into a thesis, a strategy, a final act of self-definition by a man who believed that a building could rewrite what the world thought of him. Whether he was right, whether architecture can truly redeem a man, is a question this documentary will explore. But one thing is undeniable. The three mansions Henry Clay Frick left behind form a narrative more compelling than the life he lived inside them. This is the story of that legacy, how a hated man created beauty so enduring that the world eventually forgot the hatred and remembered only the beauty. Henry Clay Frick's wealth did not come from inheritance, prestige, or education. It came from calculation. Before he built mansions that would outlast his era, he built a fortune by mastering one of the least romantic, most brutally efficient industries in America, coke production. His story begins far from Fifth Avenue, in a small farmhouse in western Pennsylvania, an environment that shaped not just his ambitions but his worldview. Frick was born in 1849 into a family with more discipline than means. His parents were strict, devout, and quietly ambitious for their children, but money was rare, and comfort was considered a luxury. Henry grew up among the concerns of working farmers: weather, soil, debts, and the unrelenting need to make each day count. His formal schooling ended at 17. From that point forward, his education came from observation of markets, of people, and of the small shifts in power that most never notice until it is too late. Even as a young man, Frick demonstrated the trait that would define him: clarity. He knew precisely what he wanted, and he understood that wanting something was meaningless unless paired with a plan, and the willingness to execute that plan without hesitation. He was neither a dreamer nor an inventor. He was a calculator, a strategist with an instinct for pressure points. In the early 1870s, western Pennsylvania was at the edge of an industrial transformation. Pittsburgh steel mills were expanding rapidly, but they depended on a fuel that few had yet fully grasped the value of: coke, a purified form of coal essential for producing high-quality steel. The industry was dirty, dangerous, and largely overlooked by men seeking glamour or fame. Frick, however, saw what others missed. The steel barons needed coke more than they needed elegance. Whoever controlled coke would control the men who made steel. At 21, with borrowed money and an audacity that baffled his relatives, Frick partnered with cousins to form a small coke-making firm. The industry required endurance, not innovation. Coke ovens ran day and night, producing heat that scorched lungs and shortened lives. But Frick's focus was not on improving conditions or inventing new processes. His talent was in efficiency, extracting every possible dollar from the operation, cutting costs with surgical precision, and negotiating contracts with a firmness that bordered on violence. Where others saw coal pits, Frick saw a monopoly waiting to be built. He bought out competitors before they realized what their businesses were worth. He acquired land strategically, securing rail access not just for convenience but to squeeze rivals who lacked it. He centralized operations, standardized production, and integrated supply lines. By his mid-20s, he controlled enough of the region's coke production to make steel magnates nervous. One of them was Andrew Carnegie. Carnegie, already rising toward national prominence, recognized in Frick a quality he lacked: an absolute willingness to do what was necessary, regardless of the cost to others. Carnegie was the philosopher of steel, the spokesman, the public face, the man who wrote politely about the duties of the rich. Frick was something very different. He was the steel industry's hard edge, the man who negotiated with clenched teeth and did not flinch in the face of conflict. Their partnership began in 1881 when Carnegie purchased a significant interest in Frick's Coke Company. It was a logical union. Carnegie needed reliable access to coke. Frick controlled the source. Together, they would build one of the largest and most profitable industrial empires in the world. But it was never a partnership of equals. Carnegie handled image. Frick handled reality. Carnegie toured Europe and wrote essays about the responsibilities of wealth. Frick remained in Pittsburgh, ensuring that every furnace stayed lit, every contract was enforced, and every worker understood that wages were negotiable but deadlines were not. Their dynamic shaped not only the steel industry, but also the architectural ambitions that would later define Frick's personal life. By the late 1880s, Frick's annual income surpassed $1 million, a staggering sum in an era of subsistence wages. But money alone did not satisfy him. Wealth was merely the foundation. What Frick wanted was acknowledgement. A place at the table of old American families whose heritage he admired but whose approval he knew he would never fully receive. This tension between wealth and legitimacy became one of the most important forces in his life. His childhood had taught him to value stability. His business career had taught him that only strength commanded respect. His rising fortune now taught him that money without architectural presence meant nothing in the eyes of the elite. It was during this period that Frick articulated, if not in words, then in choices, the philosophy that guided both his business and his architecture. Only things built to last deserve admiration. Steel endured. Stone endured. Reputation, however, was fragile. If people would not respect him willingly, he would construct something they would be forced to respect. This belief explains the houses that followed. Clayton, Eagle Rock, and 1 East 70th Street were not simply monuments to wealth. They were monuments to durability, structures built with the same ruthless logic that governed his business. Just as he consolidated the coke industry until competitors had no room to breathe, he built homes with materials and proportions that left no room for dismissal. As his power within Carnegie Steel grew, so did his desire to convert financial success into architectural permanence. Frick watched other magnates build grand residences only to have them mocked as gaudy or excessive. He took notes: what styles conveyed dignity, what materials suggested permanence, what proportions signaled authority. He studied the homes of old families, dissecting their choices with the same analytical mind that had once dissected coal contracts. By the time he began planning his first major residence in Pittsburgh, Frick was no longer just a businessman. He was a man crafting a legacy, a man who understood that wealth evaporates but stone remembers. The discipline of his childhood, the calculation of his early career, and the hard lessons of industrial conflict all converged into one idea: build not for today, but for a future that will judge you differently. And in the world he was entering, judgment came not from ledger books but from architecture. By the early 1890s, Henry Clay Frick had become one of the most powerful men in American industry, and one of the most resented. The steel empire he helped build relied on a workforce that endured exhausting hours, dangerous furnaces, and wages that barely kept families afloat. Tension between labor and management was inevitable. But at Homestead, the conflict would explode into something far more violent, something that would scar Frick's reputation forever, and shape the way he built his homes for the rest of his life. Homestead, a massive steel complex outside Pittsburgh, was one of the crown jewels of the Carnegie Empire. For years, the workers there had relied on a strong union, the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers, to negotiate their contracts. Frick believed that such unions were obstacles, costly, unpredictable, and incompatible with the efficiency he prized above all else. By 1892, the tension had reached a breaking point. The workers expected to negotiate. Frick intended to eliminate the union entirely. The build-up to confrontation felt like the tightening of a vice. As contract expiration approached, Frick issued wage cuts and ultimatums. He constructed a massive fence around the mill, 12 feet high, topped with barbed wire, studded with watchtowers. Locals gave it a nickname that stuck immediately: Fort Frick. The fence was more than a barrier. It was a declaration. The mill would not be governed by workers. It would be governed by management, and Frick was management embodied. Inside the mill, workers armed themselves with makeshift weapons, preparing for what seemed inevitable. Outside the gates, Tension spread through the community. Newspapers predicted confrontation. Families braced for violence. Carnegie, thousands of miles away in Scotland, publicly promoted peace while privately allowing Frick to take whatever measures he deemed necessary. It was a perfect setup for disaster. At dawn on July 6, 1892, disaster arrived. Under Frick's orders, barges carrying 300 Pinkerton agents traveled up the Monongahela River toward the mill. Their mission was simple: seize control of the plant, escort in replacement workers, and crush the strike before it could gain momentum. But the workers knew the Pinkertons were coming. As the barges drifted into view, thousands of steelworkers and their families lined the riverbank. The standoff lasted only minutes before shots were fired, both sides claiming the other struck first. What followed was a 14-hour battle that stunned the nation. Gunfire, rocks, iron bolts, burning rafts, improvised shields, an industrial war fought on American soil. By the time the Pinkertons surrendered, 9 workers lay dead and countless others were injured. The agents were beaten as they were marched through jeering crowds. National outrage erupted not just at the violence, but at the idea that a private company had employed armed mercenaries to enforce its will. Frick, however, did not flinch. To him, the Pinkertons were tools, no more emotional to use than furnaces or railcars. When news of the bloodshed reached him, he maintained that the strike had to be broken for the sake of order and efficiency. He expected anger. He did not expect what came next. 2 weeks after the battle, with the mill still under militia control, a young anarchist named Alexander Berkman entered Frick's office pretending to be a courier. Without hesitation, Berkman pulled out a revolver and fired at point-blank range. One bullet struck Frick in the neck, grazing his spine. The second tore through his shoulder. As Frick collapsed, Berkman lunged forward with a sharpened steel file and stabbed him 3 times before being tackled by office staff. The attack should have killed him. Instead, Frick forced himself upright, refused medical care until paperwork was completed, and returned to work the next morning with bandages covering his wounds. To the public, the display was astonishing. To his critics, it was infuriating. To his allies, unsettling. But to Frick himself, it was a turning point. From that moment forward, Henry Clay Frick understood something that would shape the rest of his life. Wealth creates targets. Power breeds enemies. And safety, true safety, could not be entrusted to guards, fences, or hired agents. It had to be built into the walls around him. The assassination attempt hardened him not just against workers, but against the world. If he had ever doubted that a man of his fortune needed to be protected, Homestead erased the doubt entirely. When he began planning his residence in Pittsburgh shortly afterward, Frick approached it not simply as a home but as a defensive structure. Clayton, on Penn Avenue, carried the signature look of the Richardsonian Romanesque style: thick stone walls, narrow windows, a presence that felt anchored to the earth itself. The architectural choice was aesthetic, yes, but it was also psychological. The house projected solidity, warning, immovability. Even in domestic architecture, Frick refused vulnerability. In his mind, beauty mattered, but survival mattered more. Homestead taught him another lesson as well. Public anger was temporary. Buildings were permanent. People's outrage would burn hot and fade, but stone, properly chosen, properly crafted, would endure. If he could not silence his critics, he could outlast them. Architecture, not apology, would become his answer to the hatred that followed him. As the years passed, this fortress mindset evolved into something more strategic. Frick no longer built merely to protect himself. He built to reshape judgment. If his enemies could not destroy him, they might eventually forget him. But they would not forget the buildings he left behind. His homes would stand longer than newspaper headlines, longer than the bitterness of the Homestead strike, longer than the lifetimes of the men who cursed him. Homestead had made him a villain. Architecture, he believed, could make him something else. Clayton would be the first test of this philosophy. Newport would refine it. And on Fifth Avenue, in the mansion that would one day become the Frick Collection, he would attempt something unprecedented. To build a structure so commanding, so serene, so aligned with cultural memory that it could overwrite the violence that funded it. It was an audacious idea, dangerous, perhaps immoral, but unmistakably Frick. When Henry Clay Frick set out to build his first true mansion, he was not thinking of comfort, nor of extravagance, nor even of beauty. He was thinking of message. For a man who had become the most polarizing figure in Pittsburgh, architecture was not simply a private indulgence. It was a declaration of status, a shield, and a way of asserting permanence in a city where thousands wished him gone. Clayton, the residence he built on Penn Avenue, was his opening statement to a world that admired his fortune yet loathed the manner in which he earned it. Pittsburgh in the 1890s was a gritty industrial cathedral of smokestacks, rail yards, and the constant percussion of steelmaking. Yet even here, amid the clang and soot, there existed a narrow district where the city's wealthiest families attempted to escape the grime that paid for their splendor. Penn Avenue was the heart of this enclave. The addresses there were more than locations, they were credentials. To live on Penn Avenue was to be admitted, if not fully accepted, into Pittsburgh's emerging elite. Frick selected a large corner lot at 7200 Penn Avenue, knowing precisely what it represented. It placed him among the bankers, the mine owners, the lawyers, the people whose names appeared on civic boards rather than strike reports. He intended the location to announce that Henry Clay Frick was not simply an industrialist with a growing bank balance. He was a man of stature, a man who belonged in the rooms where influence quietly circulated. The architectural style he chose for Clayton reinforced this ambition. Frick hired Frederick J. Osterling, a respected Pittsburgh architect versed in Richardsonian Romanesque design, a style deeply associated with weight, seriousness, and permanence. Romanesque houses were not playful or delicate. They spoke with the authority of medieval fortresses and town halls. Heavy stone walls, round arches, deep-set windows, and asymmetrical towers gave them a presence that bordered on intimidating. And that was precisely what Frick wanted. Clayton rose from the ground like a building determined to outlast the city around it. The facade combined Indiana limestone and warm brick, arranged not for lightness but for gravity. The rounded entrance arch framed a thick oak door. The stone tower that anchored one wing gave the house the silhouette of a small fortress. Even in broad daylight, Clayton cast long shadows, suggesting both comfort and caution. But while the exterior radiated might, the interior revealed a different story, one shaped not by Frick's iron temperament but by Adelaide Childs Frick, the woman he had married in 1882. Adelaide came from a respected Pittsburgh family and understood social nuance in ways Henry never quite mastered. She knew which fabrics signaled refinement, which colors softened a room, which arrangements suggested inviting domesticity rather than cold display. If the exterior projected power, the interior projected legitimacy. It was her realm, and she filled it with warmth that Henry might never have chosen for himself. Upon entering Clayton, visitors found themselves in a reception hall paneled in polished hardwoods that glowed beneath gaslight. A grand staircase, carved with intricate detail, rose gracefully to the second floor. The library, one of the house's most commanding rooms, was lined with floor-to-ceiling bookcases and punctuated by a carved stone fireplace. Though Frick was not an avid reader, he understood the symbolic power of such a space. Libraries signified cultivation, seriousness, and aspiration toward higher society. Adelaide ensured it also held comfortable furniture and the subtle touch of lived-in elegance. The dining room reflected the couple's shared ambitions. Adelaide selected refined furnishings. Frick approved the scale. The room seated 24, allowing the Fricks to host the business dinners and social gatherings that were essential to climbing Pittsburgh's social ladder. The stained glass windows added a touch of romanticism to space otherwise dominated by dark woods and heavy drapery. Yet beneath the domestic charm, Clayton carried the imprint of its owner's paranoia. The windows on certain sides of the house were smaller than fashionable homes of the era. Their height above ground level made break-ins more difficult without announcing fear. The thick stone walls served not only aesthetic goals but provided structural reinforcement far beyond typical residential needs. Doors were solid, hinges fortified, and sightlines carefully managed so the household staff could monitor entrances discreetly. Clayton never felt overtly defensive, But the bones of the house told the truth. A man who had been shot in his office was preparing for the possibility of further threats. Inside these walls, Frick hoped to craft a life defined by upward mobility and stability. But tragedy followed him into the home he hoped would symbolize triumph. Frick and Adelaide had 4 children. Only 2 would survive to adulthood. Their daughter Martha died unexpectedly at 6 years old. Their son Henry Jr. died of a heart condition before reaching his 5th birthday. The rooms Adelaide had decorated with maternal care became spaces marked by grief. Those losses lingered in the home's atmosphere. The children's rooms, lovingly prepared and abruptly abandoned, carried a quiet sadness that contrasted sharply with the public grandeur of the reception rooms. Clayton became a house divided between 2 identities: a public stage where Frick demonstrated authority and refinement, and a private refuge where sorrow settled into the corners like dust. To visitors, the mansion projected success, tasteful, composed, and rooted in the kind of architectural language associated with seriousness rather than ostentation. But behind its stone facade, the home bore the shadows of both public hatred and private heartbreak. Friends who visited Adelaide in the years after the children's deaths often remarked that the house felt solemn, as if the weight of its materials reflected the weight of the family's loss. For Frick, however, Clayton fulfilled its purpose. It placed him among Pittsburgh's elite, shielded him from his enemies, and announced that he was not merely a man of commerce but a man capable of building something that mattered. Yet even he sensed that the city where his fortune was born would never fully accept him. Pittsburgh knew the story of Homestead. Pittsburgh remembered the Pinkertons. Pittsburgh had witnessed the bloodshed. Clayton was a beginning, but not a conclusion. It showed Frick what architecture could accomplish, but also what it could not. Respect required more than stone. And in the city that feared him, acceptance would always be limited. So Frick began looking elsewhere. Somewhere far from the mills, far from the anger, somewhere where a man with enough money might reinvent himself. That place was Newport. By the late 1890s, Henry Clay Frick understood something he had once refused to admit. Pittsburgh could give him wealth, but it could never give him legitimacy. No matter how grand Clayton appeared on Penn Avenue, no matter how many dinners Adelaide hosted, no matter how many political figures entered his reception hall, Frick's reputation in his home city had been locked in place by the Homestead strike. In Pittsburgh, he would always be the man behind Fort Frick, the architect of broken unions. Respect was possible. Acceptance was not. So Frick turned his attention to a different stage, one where money could be converted with enough effort and the right introductions into a new kind of social capital. Newport, Rhode Island was that stage. Newport in the Gilded Age was a paradox. A quiet seaside town transformed each summer into the densest concentration of wealth in America. The great families, the Vanderbilts, Astors, Belmonts, Ulrichs, descended upon the cliffs with their armies of servants, leaving behind the smoke and commerce of New York. Their cottages were palaces in disguise, built to host successors of European courts, designed to confirm status, not to test it. Newport was not merely a destination. It was an examination, an unspoken audition for entry into a world that valued heritage and restraint far more than the size of one's fortune. Frick arrived knowing he would never fully belong. He lacked the bloodlines, the pedigrees, the inherited expectations that defined old money. What he possessed instead was determination, and a willingness to adapt his architectural ambitions to the codes of a society that watched newcomers with forensic scrutiny. In 1899, Frick purchased a substantial property in an area outside Newport's main cluster of palaces. It was called Eagle Rock, and it differed from the marble and limestone extravagance of Bellevue Avenue. Instead of adopting the ostentatious French or Italian styles that Gilded Age magnates used to shout their presence, Eagle Rock embraced the shingle style, an architectural language that suggested understatement, ease, and coastal informality. For Frick, it was a strategic pivot. In Pittsburgh, power was expressed through stone and solidity. In Newport, power was expressed through appearing effortlessly unbothered. The house at Eagle Rock had long, sweeping rooflines covered in cedar shingles, verandas that opened toward the ocean breeze, and irregular shapes that suggested growth rather than orchestration. Its muted wood exterior blended with the rocky shoreline rather than dominating it. The message was clear. This was not the home of a man desperate for attention. It was the home of someone confident enough not to need it. Of course, the illusion of informality was precisely that, an illusion. The interior was meticulously planned. Great rooms were arranged to ensure optimal flow during gatherings. The dining room was proportioned for dinners that mattered. The library, unlike Clayton's symbolic showpiece, became a working space where Frick managed business affairs while pretending he was merely a summer gentleman enjoying sea air. But Eagle Rock belonged to Adelaide as much as it did to Henry, perhaps more. In Newport, Adelaide understood the rules better than her husband ever would. Invitations had to be extended with exquisite timing. Social calls required a delicate balance, never too eager, never too aloof. Dinners needed to be intimate enough to feel exclusive but large enough to demonstrate relevance. Adelaide navigated these rituals with the subtlety of a seasoned diplomat. She learned which families could be approached directly and which required a mutual acquaintance to make an introduction. She studied the hosting habits of Newport's oldest families. Afternoon teas that doubled as reconnaissance, musicales that served as displays of refinement, and garden parties where alliances were quietly negotiated behind fans and parasols. Eagle Rock became Adelaide's stage, and she performed flawlessly. For Henry, the town offered something different. A reprieve. In Pittsburgh, every public appearance carried tension. In Newport, the air was lighter, literally and socially. The coal smoke that clouded Clayton's skyline was replaced by ocean breeze. The hostility that followed him in industrial cities faded among the manicured lawns and hydrangeas. Newport society, though wary, was not openly hostile. Here, Frick was judged not by the strike he had crushed but by how he hosted a dinner, how he positioned his home, and how seamlessly his family fit into seasonal routines. Yet the town carried a quiet, immovable hierarchy. Old families regarded new fortunes with polite tolerance but with unmistakable distance. Their acceptance was conditional. Their embrace was partial. At Eagle Rock, Frick entertained prominent guests, but he was never the center of gravity. He attended the right events, contributed to the right causes, but doors that opened easily for the Vanderbilts opened only partially for him. In private moments, Frick recognized the truth. Newport could soften his image, but it could not erase it. He could purchase land, commission architects, and follow protocol, but he could not buy lineage. His children could play in the gardens of old families, but the shadow of Homestead lingered behind him like a permanent escort. Still, Eagle Rock taught him something invaluable, something he would carry into his final and greatest architectural project. In Newport, Frick learned that architecture could express grace without sacrificing strength. Where Clayton was a fortress softened by domesticity, Eagle Rock was elegance reinforced by privacy. The house showed Frick that beauty could mask caution, that informality could be curated, that a home could be welcoming without ever allowing the world too close. The lesson was simple but profound. In societies that judge appearance, privacy is the highest form of power. Eagle Rock functioned exactly as intended. It placed Frick into social currents he could never access in Pittsburgh. It gave Adelaide a platform where she shined. It allowed their surviving children to grow up among the rituals of genteel society rather than industrial conflict. It provided a summer sanctuary, separate from the grime and grief of their western Pennsylvania life. But it was also transitional. Newport refined Frick's ambitions but did not satisfy them. It was a place to be seen, not remembered. The families who mattered spent winters in New York, and their influence, cultural, political, and architectural, radiated from Fifth Avenue. If Frick wanted permanence, if he wanted the architecture he built to outlast the judgments of his era, he needed a stage larger, louder, and more enduring than a summer colony. Newport taught him the manners of the elite. New York would allow him to rewrite his legacy. By the turn of the century, Henry Clay Frick had learned two truths that would shape the final and most consequential act of his life. First, Pittsburgh would never grant him admiration. Second, Newport would never grant him belonging. If he wanted a place where his legacy could be recast, not through apology but through architecture, he needed a city capable of transforming reputations. That city was New York. Its skyline was rising, its culture maturing, and its social map undergoing seismic shifts. And in that evolving geography, Frick saw an opening. Fifth Avenue, once a quiet residential street of brownstones, had become the corridor of America's wealthiest families. North of 72nd Street lay the established bastions of old money, families whose names were synonymous with inherited influence. South of 60th Street, commerce was creeping upward, threatening to push out the very people who defined the avenue's prestige. The stretch between those two worlds, the blocks around East 70th Street, was a fragile border where fortune, culture, and reputation collided. Frick understood borders. He had built his career manipulating them. And here, on this narrow zone between tradition and expansion, he found the perfect place to reshape how history would judge him. In 1906, Frick made his move. Instead of purchasing a single lot, he bought an entire blockfront, one of the most audacious residential land acquisitions in Manhattan's history. The decision was not financial. It was symbolic. By securing the entire piece of land, Frick guaranteed control of neighbors, of noise, of the architectural narrative that would surround him. It was a gesture of dominance disguised as prudence. To Frick, Fifth Avenue was not a mere address. It was a stage, and he intended to build a masterpiece upon it. But the mansion he envisioned would be unlike Clayton or Eagle Rock. Those homes had been built for living, for family, for social aspiration. The Fifth Avenue house served a different purpose. Frick had reached a stage of life where presence mattered more than comfort, and memory mattered more than belonging. He wanted a building that would stand long after his name had lost its sting. He wanted to construct a vessel for a legacy he knew he could no longer curate in person. In short, Frick was no longer building for life. He was building for afterlife. This required an architectural language that transcended fashion. Victorian exuberance was out of the question. Newport's playful shingle style would not do. Even Romanesque austerity, so effective at Clayton, would feel dated within a decade. Frick needed something that communicated dignity, restraint, and universality. He needed classicism. To achieve this, he hired Carrere and Hastings, the celebrated Beaux-Arts firm responsible for the New York Public Library. Their style was defined by French neoclassical order: symmetry, proportion, limestone, and harmony. These were not the materials of trends. They were the materials of institutions. Frick had chosen architects whose work was designed to last not decades, but centuries. Carrere and Hastings immediately understood the assignment. The Fifth Avenue mansion was to appear residential on paper, but institutional in spirit. It needed to speak softly yet assert its presence. It needed to convey refinement without excess. It needed to feel timeless, neither Victorian nor modern, neither ostentatious nor austere. Frick's instructions were concise but profound. Build something that looks as if it has always been here and will always remain. The result was a neoclassical palace with the temperament of a museum. Limestone walls rose in perfectly measured courses, each block carved to precise tolerances. The facade was symmetrical without appearing rigid, elegant without appearing fragile. Deep-set windows provided both privacy and controlled light. The entrance, framed by a restrained portico, welcomed visitors not with theatrical grandeur but with a quiet, almost monastic calm. Yet the true genius of the project was not in the facade. It was in the concept. Frick envisioned his mansion as a museum-home hybrid, a space crafted not for the rhythms of domestic life, but for the sober display of art. Unlike the Vanderbilts, who built ballrooms to impress guests, Frick built galleries to impress posterity. The house would house Rembrandts, Vermeers, Turners, Whistlers, paintings he had spent years acquiring with a collector's ferocity. He instructed the architects to design rooms that elevated the art rather than merely accommodating it. Skylights were planned for even illumination. Walls were built to exact dimensions to fit specific paintings. Sightlines were engineered so that visitors would encounter artworks in controlled, almost ceremonial progressions. Everything about the house was intentional. Nothing was accidental. But the building was more than a museum. It was a strategic answer to a personal question. How do you outthink the judgment of time? Frick knew that his reputation, damaged by Homestead and hardened by decades of corporate battles, would never fully recover among his contemporaries. But he also understood something deeper. Public memory was selective. It favored what it could see, touch, and visit. It forgot scandals faster than it forgot beauty. So he built beauty. He designed the mansion to operate as a residence only temporarily. The larger, more permanent purpose lay in the will he drafted shortly after construction began. In that document, Frick stated that upon the death of his wife Adelaide, the house should become a public museum, a place where New Yorkers and future generations could walk through rooms arranged exactly as he intended. This provision transformed the building. What looked like a private palace was, in truth, an institution wearing the disguise of a home. The study was a gallery. The living room was a gallery. The garden court, added later by architect John Russell Pope, was a museum atrium before the word was ever used. Frick had outmaneuvered time. He had built not a house, but a future. The Fifth Avenue mansion was a gamble in every sense. A gamble that taste would revert to classicism, a gamble that Fifth Avenue would remain prestigious, a gamble that his art would retain value, a gamble that New York would protect what he built rather than replace it. But most of all, it was a gamble that architecture could rewrite the legacy his life had scarred. On this block, at the border of Old Money North and Commercial South, Henry Clay Frick placed his final wager, a stone-bound argument meant not for his peers, but for the centuries that would follow. When construction finally began at 1 East 70th Street, Frick was not simply erecting a home. He was carving permanence into the spine of Fifth Avenue. Every decision, from the limestone blocks he approved to the proportions he demanded, was chosen with an almost imperial conviction. This building would outlast gossip, outrage, reputational ruin, and even the Gilded Age itself. It would be the last argument he ever made, and he intended that argument to stand in stone. From the street, the mansion appeared deceptively simple. A long limestone facade, measured and balanced with the precision of a classical temple, stretched across the block like a quiet proclamation. Unlike the florid mansions of the Vanderbilts, dripping with carved ornament, Frick's exterior contained not a single flourish that wasn't structural. The limestone was smooth, unembellished, and monumental in its restraint. Its color, a pale, almost chalky stone, shifted from warm gold in morning light to cold silver at dusk. Frick understood the psychological power of material. Limestone was not merely durable. It was dignified. It suggested origins older than the Republic itself. The proportions of the facade followed the Beaux-Arts principle of harmonic balance. 3 visible floors arranged in perfect vertical alignment, the fourth recessed behind a balustrade so discreetly that casual observers rarely noticed it. The windows were tall and narrow, echoing European palaces without imitating any specific one. Their spacing, mathematically calculated through repeated revisions, created a rhythm that felt inevitable, as though the building had grown out of the city rather than been imposed upon it. But the facade was only the surface. Beneath its skin lay engineering decisions that revealed Frick's obsession with endurance. The foundations extended nearly 30 feet into the Manhattan bedrock, more akin to commercial skyscraper construction than a private home. The steel frame was over-engineered, with beams capable of withstanding loads far heavier than the building would ever experience. Most mansions of the period used lighter steel or even timber reinforcement. Frick demanded a skeleton that could last centuries. The windows, though elegant, were not the wooden sashes common in New York residences. They were bronze, custom-crafted, triple-glazed, and fitted so tightly they sealed with the quiet authority of a bank vault. Bronze resists corrosion. Bronze does not warp. Bronze does not burn. These were not windows for a house. These were windows for an institution. Every door followed the same philosophy. They appeared wooden, but many of the most critical ones hid bronze cores beneath their polished veneers. Hinges and locks were manufactured by Yale and Town, then the most respected makers of security hardware in America. Their mechanisms were concealed in deep pockets within the door frames, invisible but formidable. A guest entering the mansion might admire the craftsmanship of the door. Few realized it weighed nearly as much as a piano. Security lived everywhere, yet nowhere obvious. Frick understood that ostentatious protection invited suspicion. Instead, the architects integrated defense into the architecture itself. Ground floor windows were set in unusually deep reveals, making them impossible to pry open quickly. The height of the sill was calibrated so a man standing outside could not reach inside without exposing his torso to view. Sight lines across the approach were deliberately clear. There were no shrubs, no trees, no ornamental clutter that could conceal movement. The main entrance, centered on the facade, appeared approachable but was positioned behind a slight grade, a psychological tactic that made visitors look up, subtly disempowering them. Behind that doorway hid a vestibule designed for rapid lockdown. The doors could be barred in seconds. Staff were trained not simply for hospitality but for protection. Frick had lived through an assassination attempt. He had learned that power required vigilance, and that vigilance could be disguised in beauty. The garden wall on East 70th Street told its own story. On the surface, it was a privacy barrier, a handsome limestone wall topped with elegant bronze railings. But its placement and height were strategic. It created a buffer zone between the mansion and the street, a controlled perimeter with a single point of entry. No one could approach the side of the house without being in full view of the windows above. For Frick, the garden was not just landscaping. It was a defensive moat in the form of manicured luxury. Even the building's slight setback from Fifth Avenue, the space of only a few feet, was deliberate. It created a subtle psychological distinction. The house did not belong to the street belonged to the house. Pedestrians walked beside it, not toward it. The mansion existed on its own plane of authority. The limestone blocks themselves were chosen through a process so meticulous that nearly 15% were rejected on site. Each block had to match the others not only in color but in grain and density. Hastings insisted that joints be hairline thin, so the seams vanished into the stone. Visitors today often assume the building is carved from a single colossal mass rather than assembled. That illusion was intentional. Frick wanted the appearance of geological permanence, not architectural assembly. The roofline was another study in underplayed sophistication. Instead of the flamboyant mansard roofs fashionable among Gilded Age elites, the Frick mansion used a simple copper roof, low-sloped, clean-edged, almost invisible from street level. Copper weathers into a soft blue-green patina over decades. Frick chose it because it would age without rotting, cracking, or demanding attention. A roof that disappears, he believed, makes a building appear calmer, older, and closer to timeless. Inside the structure, mechanical systems were built with the same obsessive foresight. Electrical conduits were oversized to allow for future rewiring. Ducts were installed even before central air systems existed, because Frick suspected technology would evolve. Floors were reinforced to handle the weight of marble sculptures and massive paintings. The house was meant not just to survive changes in taste but changes in technology. Every architectural choice, visible or hidden, revealed a man who feared the erosion of legacy more than the erosion of stone. Frick wanted his mansion to age like a European institution. Slowly, gracefully, with the aura of something that had always existed and always would. He studied the Louvre, the Uffizi, and English country houses that had stood for centuries. Their secret was proportion and material. Their elegance came from restraint, not decoration. Their power came from the fact that they could absorb time without bending to it. So he built his own American version of those ideals. Not a palace for the living, but a monument for the future. And when the final limestone block was set into place, Frick had done something astonishing. He had built a fortress that did not look like a fortress. He had constructed a museum that pretended to be a home. He had forged a legacy in architecture, not to protect himself in life, but to outmaneuver the judgment that would follow his death. Stepping through the front door of 1 East 70th Street was like entering a world arranged for silence. The entrance hall did not overwhelm visitors with a sweeping staircase or excessive ornament. Instead, it created a hush, an intentional lowering of the voice, the heartbeat, the mood. Light filtered down from a skylight overhead, cool and indirect, softening the marble beneath your feet. Frick's choice was theatrical, but in a quiet, disciplined way. The house did not greet you. It regarded you. It required you to adjust to its tempo, its calm, its confidence. From that first moment, everything inside the mansion seemed designed to present an illusion of peace, an illusion Frick himself never quite believed in. But for his guests, for future museum-goers, even for Adelaide, the entrance hall functioned like a palate cleanser. The chaos of Fifth Avenue vanished behind the bronze door, replaced by something older, steadier, and impossibly controlled. Beyond the hall waited the West Gallery, the heart of Frick's architectural and artistic ambition. The room stretched 70 feet, yet its proportions made it feel neither cavernous nor intimate, but balanced, like a cathedral built for private worship. The ceiling rose 19 feet, supported by beams hidden so cleverly that the roof seemed to float. Light poured from the skylight above, softened by diffusing panels designed to mimic the glow of a Northern European studio, the kind Rembrandt might have painted in. The damask walls, rose-colored, warm, chosen with obsessive attention to hue, held the light in a gentle embrace. Here hung the masters. Rembrandt's portraits stared back with the gravity of centuries. Vermeer's quiet interior scenes glowed with their strange, impossible calm. Van Dyck, Gainsborough, Holbein, each painting positioned with mathematical precision, each frame chosen for harmony rather than display. In any other museum, these works might have felt distant, elevated behind velvet ropes. In Frick's gallery, they appeared disarmingly close, their presence softened by the domestic setting. Frick had not built a gallery. He had built a sanctuary for himself, a place where the violence of his public life could not reach him. The West Gallery was his attempt at redemption through beauty, an aesthetic ceasefire created by a man more accustomed to battle. Moving southward from the gallery, the library opened like a refuge carved into wood and silence. English oak panels lined the room, polished to a gentle sheen that reflected the garden light outside. The fireplace dominated the far wall, its marble mantel heavy, almost solemn. The furniture was comfortable but firm, chairs designed not for lounging but for thinking. And always the windows. They overlooked the garden court, which in Frick's lifetime was still an open courtyard, not yet enclosed by John Russell Pope's later design. Even then, the sight of green space, fresh air, and measured tranquility softened the severity of the mansion's interior. The library was Frick's preferred retreat, though it was designed from the beginning with its future public purpose in mind. He read rarely, but he contemplated often. The room allowed him to perform the role of cultured collector while offering a space where he could sit, like a general after battle, reviewing the spoils of his conquests. It was one of the few places where he could be alone without feeling exposed. Above the library and gallery, the tone shifted noticeably. The second floor held the family rooms, Adelaide's suites to the north, Frick's to the south. Their difference revealed the divide between the lives they lived and the image they presented. Adelaide's rooms were lighter, more decorative, furnished with French pieces she chose herself. Her sitting room held soft draperies, floral patterns, and touches of domestic warmth that felt almost out of place in the otherwise stern mansion. It was here she kept the house functioning. Here she reviewed social invitations, managed household staff, and maintained the fragile social thread required to hold their world together. Her spaces felt lived in, loved, and distinctly separate from the public identity of the home. Frick's chambers were the opposite. Stripped of ornament, furnished with confident restraint, his rooms reflected his businesslike approach to every part of life. Heavy wood, muted fabrics, functional comfort, never indulgence. Even in the privacy of his own quarters, Frick chose rooms that communicated authority. His bedroom felt less like a sanctuary and more like an office with a bed. The man who built one of the most beautiful houses in America never truly built a place for himself to rest. The guest rooms revealed another layer of the mansion's personality, polite hospitality tinged with distance. Each was decorated individually, but none with the personal touches that might suggest belonging. They were spaces for visitors to admire, not inhabit. The house extended courtesy, but not intimacy. Yet as one moved further through the mansion, an entire invisible architecture began to emerge. The world of servants, hidden in corridors and stairwells never meant for public view. Behind perfectly paneled walls lay passageways barely wide enough for a person to pass. These corridors allowed staff to move throughout the mansion without interrupting the illusion of a self-operating home. The mechanical systems were masterpieces of hidden engineering. Heating pipes ran through concealed channels. Electrical wiring was routed through spaces deliberately oversized in anticipation of future upgrades. Service stairs connected every floor, ensuring the movement of food, laundry, and staff occurred silently in the background. Even the locations of radiators were chosen so that their grills blended with the architecture. Every hum of machinery was muffled. Every draft was controlled. The house worked not because it was grand, but because it was orchestrated. That orchestration extended to the soundscape of the mansion. Public rooms absorbed footsteps through thick rugs. Private rooms softened them with layered drapery. The structure was built not simply to withstand noise, but to eliminate it. Peace was engineered. This was perhaps the most extraordinary contradiction of the home. It was designed for comfort by a man who never felt safe. Every peaceful detail required work, planning, and vigilance. The tranquility of the West Gallery depended on steel beams no visitor ever saw. The calm of the library relied on defensive design choices in the windows and walls. The serene family rooms existed only because of hidden pathways where servants labored around the clock. Even the garden court's quiet beauty owed its existence to a perimeter wall engineered with the suspicion of a fortress. Frick built a masterpiece of domestic grace, and then filled it with the shadow of his own unease. The mansion promised peace to every visitor except the man who commissioned it. When he walked through his own home, Frick did not see rose damask or limestone or the glow of Vermeer. He saw sightlines, vulnerabilities, points of entry. He saw the roof as protection, the galleries as statements, the library as a retreat from a world that hated him. Beauty was his armor. Architecture was his shield. And yet, through some alchemy of proportion, light, and restrained grandeur, the house became something he had never fully achieved in life. A place where others could feel safe, calm, and inspired. A home that gave peace to everyone but its builder. By the time Frick's mansion rose along the edge of Central Park, Fifth Avenue had already become a graveyard of architectural ambitions disguised as triumphs. The great palaces of America's wealthiest families lined the avenue like a parade of stone giants, each one built to outshine the next, each one proclaiming power that its owners believed would last forever. Yet almost none of them survive today. Their names have been absorbed into footnotes, their facades into rubble. And among the ruins of that vanished world, Frick's mansion remains. Quiet, immovable, and undefeated. Understanding why requires stepping back into the Fifth Avenue of the early 20th century, when every family with aspirations built not just a home, but a statement. These houses were not expressions of taste. They were declarations of identity, wealth, and lineage in a nation that had none of the old hierarchies to confer status. Architecture became the language through which the new aristocracy attempted to write itself into permanence. The most legendary of these efforts belonged to the Vanderbilts, who transformed blocks of the avenue into a French Renaissance fantasy. William Henry Vanderbilt built a double mansion at 51st Street, its facade dripping with carved details, balconies, and flourishes imported from the Loire Valley. Cornelius Vanderbilt too followed with an enormous chateau at 57th Street, over 100 rooms, the largest private residence New York had ever seen. It was meant to be eternal. It was demolished in 1927, 40 years after completion. That was the pattern. The Astors, the Whitneys, the Havmeyers, the Huntingtons. So many families whose wealth built entire blocks now exist only in photographs and a few mislabeled museum plaques. Their palaces fell because they were too big, too decorative, too expensive, too bound to the tastes of a moment. They were triumphs of ego, but failures of foresight. Frick studied every one of them. He examined what worked, what failed, who endured, and who vanished. He watched how Fifth Avenue shifted, how commerce crept up from Midtown, devouring mansions that had the misfortune of standing too far south. He saw how changes in taste turned ornate chateaus into embarrassments. He noted how maintenance costs drained heirs who lacked their parents' steel-forged fortunes, forcing sales, subdivision, or demolition. Frick was ruthless because he was observant. He did not intend to join the casualties. His solution was radical: build a mansion that wasn't really a mansion. At least not in the same way the Vanderbilts or Astors define the term. Frick's house had all the outward elegance expected of its rank, but beneath the limestone skin was a different purpose entirely. He was creating an institution wrapped in the disguise of a home. This was the difference that changed everything. Where the Vanderbilt mansions were built for parties, gilded ballrooms, marble staircases, ceilings painted with allegories, Frick built spaces calibrated for a life beyond his own. Galleries, a library meant for future public use. An entrance hall designed not only to receive guests but to guide crowds. Every proportion inside the mansion anticipated the foot traffic of museum visitors who would someday walk where the Frick family lived. He was designing for posterity from the first blueprint. Carnegie, to the north, had taken a different approach. He built his mansion at 91st Street, impressive, yes, but far from the heart of society. He wanted respectability, not dominance. Carnegie's house survived because of its isolation. It escaped the commercial surge, but it also lived a quieter life, almost forgotten until it became a museum later. It was a retreat, not a declaration. Frick wanted both, to be central and eternal. So he aimed for the middle geographically and socially. 70th Street became his battleground of legacy. Far enough north to avoid the commercial tide that wiped out the Astors, close enough south to remain relevant among the surviving elite. This delicate balance, almost mathematical in its precision, placed the Frick mansion outside the reach of both commercial encroachment and social irrelevance. No other Fifth Avenue builder had made such a strategic choice. Most built where fashion drove them. Frick built where time would protect him. And then there was the matter of style. The Vanderbilt houses embraced extravagance. Mansard roofs, carved pediments, balconies shaped like jewelry settings. These details delighted in the moment but aged quickly, betraying their decade of origin with every flourish. Frick rejected this entirely. He chose neoclassical simplicity. Columns with no excess ornament, windows with minimal surrounds, a facade that looked carved from a single block. It was not meant to impress with decoration. It was meant to endure through restraint. You cannot date a building that refuses to participate in architectural fashion. That was Frick's genius and his competitors' downfall. Yet the most consequential factor, the one that sealed the fate of Fifth Avenue's palaces, wasn't taste or location or even wealth. It was purpose. A private residence, no matter how grand, becomes a burden the moment its original owner dies. The heirs must maintain it, heat it, staff it, repair it, justify it. Most did not. The Gilded Age children sold quickly, or tore down what their parents had built. Excess became embarrassment. But Frick never intended his family to maintain the mansion. He built the solution into the architecture. The house itself would become a museum, an institution. And institutions have privileges, protections, tax status, endowments, everything private homes lack. The moment Adelaide died, the building stopped being a liability and became a civic asset. The Vanderbilts had no such plan. The Astors had no such plan. Their homes died because they were not designed for a future that no longer looked like the past. Frick's mansion lived because it was built for that future. Today, when people walk down Fifth Avenue, they pass boutiques, hotels, banks, and apartment towers that replaced the palaces of America's original millionaires. Glass and steel have erased almost every trace of the old society. Yet the Frick remains, serene, unchanged, defiantly permanent. The survival is not luck. It is meticulous calculation. It is the culmination of Frick's greatest conviction. That architecture, when engineered properly, can conquer memory. That a building can outlast public hatred, political shifts, and even the century that produced it. The mansion endures because it is not just a house. It is a thesis, Frick's final attempt to shape how he would be remembered. While the Vanderbilts became symbols of excess and decline, Frick became the man whose home became a museum people love. A transformation so successful that visitors today often forget the violence, the strikes, the blood that financed the limestone. That is the power of permanence. And Frick wielded it better than any rival on Fifth Avenue. When Henry Clay Frick died in December 1919, the mansion on East 70th Street was barely 2 months old. Still scented with fresh plaster and new varnish, still settling into the rhythm of a home not yet broken in. He had built it to outlast him, and it did so immediately. Adelaide remained its solitary guardian, moving through rooms designed for a family, but now inhabited by a single widow and a small, loyal staff who understood that the house was no longer truly a residence. It was a monument waiting for its second life. For 12 years, Adelaide held the building in a kind of suspended animation. She preserved every detail exactly as Henry had left it. The Rembrandts in their places, the damask walls untouched, the furniture arrangements aligned with his taste rather than her own. Visitors described the house as quiet, but it was more than that. It was still, a stillness born not of peace, but of respect. Adelaide understood she was living inside her husband's final argument, and she refused to tamper with its message. Yet the mansion could not remain frozen forever. Henry's will was clear. After Adelaide's death, the residence would become a museum, public institution, a place where strangers would walk through rooms that had once been private. He believed architecture could redeem reputation, and this transformation was the final step of that belief. But transforming a home into a public institution required vision and care. The first significant step toward that transformation began in 1921, only 2 years after Henry's death, when Adelaide commissioned John Russell Pope to design an addition. Pope was not chosen casually. He was one of the era's most respected architects, with a style that echoed the grandeur of the British Museum and the restrained dignity of classical Europe. He understood Hastings's original mansion so intimately that his addition feels, even today, like something Hastings himself would have drawn. The centerpiece of Pope's work was the garden court. Hastings had left it as an open courtyard, a space of light and sky within the limestone frame. But Adelaide wanted something more graceful, more permanent. Pope covered the courtyard with a great glass roof and surrounded it with arcades of classical columns. The court became an interior garden, its central fountain whispering beneath filtered daylight, its plantings softening the stone geometry. This new heart of the mansion changed everything. The garden court was not merely decorative. It created a circulation space worthy of a public institution. It provided light for adjoining galleries. It offered visitors, future visitors, a moment of calm before they encountered the intensity of the collection. Pope had created not just a room, but an atmosphere, one that carried the mansion gently into its next identity. Adelaide lived to see the garden court completed. She approved the details, the tones, the textures. She understood that Henry's house was becoming something larger than either of them, and she accepted that with quiet dignity. When she died in 1931, the mansion did not mourn. It awakened. The trustees of the estate stepped in and began the work Henry had intended from the first drawing. The early 1930s were not an ideal time to launch an art museum. The Great Depression had annihilated fortunes, shuttered businesses, and left millions jobless. Institutions of culture struggled to justify their existence. Yet the trustees moved forward with steady resolve. Henry had endowed the future museum generously, and even in economic collapse, that endowment held firm. Ironically, the very ruthlessness that had once made him despised now provided financial stability for one of the city's most beloved cultural institutions. Converting the mansion into a museum required surprisingly little physical alteration. This was the advantage of Frick's long game. Rooms already functioned like galleries. Lighting was designed for art. Circulation paths were logical and generous. The transformation was not a redesign, it was an unveiling. The second floor, once reserved for family life, became administrative space and storage. Private rooms became offices. Bedrooms became conservation spaces. Yet many architectural details were preserved because they were part of the building's narrative. Visitors might never see these rooms, but they were maintained with respect, as part of the mansion's living memory. The first-floor rooms, Frick's greatest triumph, remained almost untouched. The West Gallery still carried the glow of European masters. The living hall still held its organ, the Renaissance furniture, the gravity of a room meant for social theater. The library still looked out onto the garden court, its oak panels whispering of a quieter domestic past. When the museum finally opened to the public in December 1935, New York approached it with curiosity. Some came for the art, others for the architecture. A few came to see the house of the man who had once been among the most hated industrialists in America. But what they found surprised them. They did not find a palace of intimidation. They found beauty wrapped in silence. They found a collection displayed the way great art is meant to be seen, in scale with the human body, illuminated by natural light, framed by domestic intimacy rather than institutional grandeur. They found a building that seemed to breathe with memory, not ego. The Frick collection quickly became one of the city's most beloved museums, not because it tried to compete with the Metropolitan or the Modern, but because it offered something those vast institutions could not: closeness. Visitors felt as though they were walking through someone's private world. They could sit in front of a Vermeer and not hear the cavernous echo of a museum hall. They could see the grain of oak paneling, the softness of old rugs, the way daylight glided across a marble fireplace. They could feel, briefly, what it meant to live with beauty. The transformation from residence to museum was not merely architectural. It was moral. Millions of people who might never have heard of the Homestead strike, who might never have known the details of Frick's harsh business practices, now knew him as the man whose home housed one of the world's finest collections of European art. History softened. Memory shifted. Architecture had done exactly what Frick intended. Over the decades, expansions and modernizations were added with careful restraint. In 1977, additional galleries and a lecture hall extended the museum's reach. Later improvements integrated climate control and security systems in ways that hid the machinery of preservation beneath the grace of the original design. Through every change, the trustees honored an unwritten rule. Nothing should disrupt the illusion that this was still the Frick family's home. Today, the mansion stands as the last great survivor of the Fifth Avenue palaces, not because time spared it, but because Henry Clay Frick anticipated time itself. He built a home meant to evolve. He built a museum before it ever became one. He built a legacy that answered the public hatred he endured with the beauty that people now cross oceans to admire. The man is gone. The controversy remains. But the house endures, quietly, elegantly, defiantly, rewriting the story of its creator with every visitor who steps inside. If you enjoyed this journey through the vanished world of Gilded Age mansions and the complicated legacy of Henry Clay Frick, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us uncover more forgotten stories hidden behind America's grandest homes. Before you go, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you believe Frick's architectural legacy redeems the ruthless way he built his fortune? Or does the beauty of his mansions only deepen the contradiction? Share your perspective in the comments. I read every one.